Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Yonit Arthur. I'm an audiologist and coach. You're on the Steady Coach. Today, we're going to be talking all about the recovery process from medically unexplained chronic dizziness and other symptoms. We're going to talk about each phase of this recovery process, what your perspective might be like, what your focus should be, what challenges tend to come up during that time, and what symptoms might look like during that phase to get you all the way from ground zero, regardless of where you are today, to fully recovered. While this video is certainly focused on those of you who are dealing with PPPD, MdDS, vestibular migraine, and other medically unexplained chronic dizziness symptoms, I know many of you out there have totally different or separate symptoms: tinnitus, hyperacusis, misophonia, chronic fatigue, chronic pain, and maybe even just chronic anxiety. This recovery process that I'm going to cover today in this video will apply to you as well. Before we get started, be sure to hit the subscribe button if you're new here and the little notification bell so I can tell you when new content comes out. So phase 0 is onset, when the symptoms started. And for some of you, this was a big bang type of attack. You went from having no symptoms or very low symptoms, maybe a little sign that something big might be coming, to full-blown symptoms. For others of you, symptoms may have ramped up over time. And for still others of you, this may not be the first time you've had these symptoms. Maybe you had them a few months or a few years ago, and they went away on their own, but now suddenly they came back with a vengeance. What many of you have in common is that there was no clear cause of your symptoms. Some of you may eventually be diagnosed with something like vestibular neuritis or BPPV, which are both very common causes of dizziness, but many of you will never receive a diagnosis at all, and your symptoms may have just come out of nowhere. At this phase, phase 0, it is completely normal to be entirely overtaken and overwhelmed by the sensations you're experiencing. Most people are going to have their worst symptoms in this phase. You may have lots of other symptoms accompanying the primary symptoms you're experiencing, especially those related to anxiety and an overactive fight or flight response. You may find your heart racing, you may find yourself sweating, you may find yourself breathing rapidly, unable to sleep, unable to focus, unable to concentrate, really unable to see or notice anything other than the symptoms that have come upon you. For many of you in this phase, it is completely normal and expected for your symptoms to be 24/7. I get lots of questions on my channel from people who say, hang on, my symptoms are literally all the time. I don't get a single break. I don't even know that I notice ups and downs. Is that normal? It is totally normal. And in fact, many people start off this way. We start to see changes in the pattern of dizziness later on in later phases of this process. Your main challenge at this point is basically feeling like you're going to survive it. You may be dealing with paralyzing fear, paralyzing sensations, and may feel totally, again, helpless, overwhelmed, and not know what to do. This is why most people pretty quickly move into phase 1 of the recovery process. Phase 1 of the recovery process is what I call find and fix. This is the phase in which you are trying to get answers about why your symptoms started and what can be done to eliminate them. You probably frantically start visiting doctors, maybe starting with your general practitioner or your primary care physician. Your goal is to find the problem and treat, medicate it, cut it out, whatever needs to be done. Let's get rid of this problem because it's awful and I'm suffering and I want to go back to my normal life. Unfortunately, for many of you who are in phase 1, this phase can be a bit lengthy. And the reason for that is dizziness especially is such a non-specific symptom. It can come from so many potential problems and so many things that are normal that it can take a really long time to get to the right doctors to get the right diagnosis. And as I said back in my description of phase 0, many of you will never find out that there was anything wrong with you at all. This is just one reason that this phase can last a really long time. The other reason that this phase can last a long time is because if people are only exposed to a biomedical model of treatment, meaning the only thing they are looking for is a disease or tissue damage cause that is leading to their symptoms, and a disease or tissue-related treatment that needs to be done to get rid of them, they're going to keep hitting dead ends when they have a neural circuit problem. A neural circuit symptom means that the symptom is being produced by a nervous system error. All of our senses work by sending information to our brain so that our brain can make a prediction or try to figure out what that sense information meant in relation to its previous experiences. It compares the new information coming from your senses to old information it's had in the past. If it makes mistakes when comparing this new and old information, you're going to have symptoms. This is true for dizziness and for the other symptoms that I mentioned at the beginning of this video. So when you have a neural circuit problem, the doctors really may have nothing to find. All of your test results may come back normal. And then, because the test results are normal and there's no tissue damage or ongoing disease process that's causing symptoms, biomedical treatments don't work very well because there's such a huge range of things that doctors can test you for and potentially try to treat you for. Again, this phase can take a long time for people, especially if they've never been exposed to the idea of a neural circuit symptom. At this phase, it is also very normal to continue to feel very high levels of fear and extreme focus on your symptoms, as well as grief and anger over what you may perceive as a betrayal by your body, especially if you've never had extreme symptoms before. Unfortunately, those feelings of anxiety, fear, anger, and grief can actually be made worse by going through this very frustrating and dead-end medical diagnosis and treatment process. I want to say here that medical diagnosis process is important because we do need to make sure that there's nothing medically wrong, so that if there is something like that, you can just get treatment and move on with your life. But probably for many of you watching my channel, you've already been through phase 1 or are in phase 1 right now, and you're looking for alternatives because those answers and treatments have not worked. At this point, symptoms can be all over the place. Some of you may notice a bit of a reduction in symptoms from phase 1 simply because some time has passed and you've gotten used to it. Others of you may not notice a change in symptoms at all, or may notice what you see as a very negative change. Symptoms may morph. So the symptoms you started off with may not be the symptoms that you have at the 3-month mark or later than that. These are all normal processes that make sense, particularly when you have a neural circuit problem. Because again, we're dealing with a brain-based problem, a programming issue. So since your brain's the one in charge of the sensations and its perceptions are actually what's causing the problem, those perceptions can create pretty much any symptom imaginable. Your main challenges at this stage are just trying to figure out what's wrong with you, and that's really the bottom line in this particular phase. You may be totally convinced that there's something horribly wrong with you that desperately needs treatment, and you're utterly focused on trying to get that treatment so you can get better. Now, before phase 2, we have a bit of a choice point. Some of you are still in phase 1, and some of you will stay in phase 1 indefinitely, constantly trying to find what's wrong with you and trying new and novel treatments over and over again to try to get relief. That's why sometimes you'll see comments on my YouTube channel from people who say they've been dealing with this for a long time. And when you hear their stories, they're still spending hundreds, thousands, sometimes even tens of thousands of dollars trying to get treatments to fix a biological problem when the problem really isn't something that needs a biological treatment. Some people will slide right out of phase 1 into defeat. They may just feel that the symptoms are there, they're stuck with them, they have a broken brain, and they just need to try to live with them as best they can and move on with their lives, knowing that there's nothing that can be done about the symptoms. Having met people who get stuck in this phase, this is why I have the entire YouTube channel that I have, because I think no one should have to be stuck in defeat when there is so much that can be done. We're on phase 2 now of 6. There are so many more things that you can do to recover. Phase 2 is the turning point when you get the message that there may, in fact, be something you can do about this, and that the biomedical treatments that you have tried or not tried aren't the solution to the problem anymore. Phase 2 is the turning point. It's the transition into being open to the idea that there's nothing actually medically wrong with you and that recovery might be possible. This may be for those of you who are watching this as a first video, or for those of you who came across my work really early in the process of dealing with symptoms and are just now coming back to realize, okay, actually, I think this is what I'm dealing with, a neural circuit dizziness or neural circuit symptom problem. For some of you, this is a phase of hope. It's when you start to ask yourself questions like, what if I can recover? Maybe my brain's not broken. Maybe there's actually something I can do about this. And for others of you, this phase can bring up a lot of conflict. Is she saying this is my fault? Oh my gosh, what if this is my fault? Is she saying this is psychological? The doctor told me this was just anxiety. This is not just anxiety. Others of you may just have trouble understanding or accepting the idea that neural circuit symptoms can be so powerful and strong and feel so awful and debilitating. And there may also be some of you who feel, again, somewhat helpless because the symptoms are just so strong and you've been dealing with so much distress over them that you're like, okay, maybe I can, but I don't know how I'm going to do any of this recovery stuff. Those of you who are willing to find out more information to try to address some of those questions that come up in phase 2 will move into phase 3, the discovery process. This is where you start to seek answers for your doubts and questions. If it's not psychological, then what is she saying this is? If it's not just anxiety, what's the role that anxiety has in this? Because I know I'm feeling anxious right now. If it's not my fault, then what is it? Many of you at this point will start binge watching my channel, doing the free course, reading all sorts of books that I recommend, and taking in a ton of new information. For many of you, this new perspective is one of hope and trying to learn how to do the things that you need to do to recover. For many of you, in parallel to the hope, this can also be a time of total information overload and overwhelm. You might even find yourself oscillating or going back and forth between the two. At one point, feeling so hopeful, hearing a wonderful success story that resonates, and then on that same day, hearing another success story and having a ton of doubts about whether any of this applies to you, or watching a different video and saying, oh my gosh, how am I supposed to implement all of this in my daily life? Many of the doubts that occur in this phase are of the I'm different theme. So watch for those. If you find yourself coming to a video to ask a question about a specific symptom that you've never heard described exactly like yours, or to get clarification on whether your situation is actually the same as someone else's, it is totally legitimate to have those questions. Just recognize that those kind of doubts are part of this phase. In fact, I've said that doubts are baked into neural circuit symptoms before. What I mean by that is doubts are part of the symptoms. So in regards to symptoms here in phase 3, the discovery phase, your symptoms may still include the dizziness or other symptoms that you started off with, and new symptoms of anxiety and doubts. Whereas before, you may have just kind of accepted your fate and said, I'm just not going to get better. Now you have to deal with the added anxiety, stress, and maybe doubts relating to whether you can implement this process well or not. And I'm here to just tell you that that's normal, and many people go through that at this phase. Many of you will move on to phase 4 at this point, but some of you get stuck at phase 3. So I want to make sure you hear this. If you find yourself endlessly just consuming more and more information and not actually implementing any of the advice I talk about on my channel, you're stuck in phase 3 and you're being what we affectionately call at the Steady Coach a knowledge hamster. Shout out to Christian for coming up with that term. Knowledge hamsters are basically just spinning the wheel of knowledge over and over again, and you're not going to get anywhere. You cannot progress to the next phases of recovery, including recovery, which is what you want, if you don't start to implement. And remember those doubts I was talking about a few minutes ago? Often that's the barrier. So if you have doubts, you're not sure how to implement, and you're confused and you're overwhelmed, my best advice to you is to pick a few things and start to implement them anyway, and successfully move into phase 4, even if it's not perfect and you're not 100% sure you know what you're doing. Phase 4 is implementation. It's when you actually start to put things into practice. It's when you actually start responding to your sensations differently. It's when you actually start looking at your stress bucket, or all the things in your life, including your own internal things like thoughts and feelings and stressors, and external things like relationships with other people and life stress, and start to realize how they're impacting how sensitive your nervous system is. There is a huge range of tools available to you during the implementation phase. As we talked about in phase 3, that can be a bit of a problem for some people. So what you're doing now is figuring out how to structure your daily life so that you can start using the tools and bringing that level of nervous system alert down. Of course, if you need guidance on how to implement, that's what the free course is there for. So if you've already taken the free course, especially if you took it in phase 2 or 3, where you were kind of trying to figure out if it might work, and then you were maybe a little knowledge hamstering, phase 4 might be worth taking an extra look at it, because that will give you an idea of what tools you can actually build into your day. For those of you who want a really structured approach, that's why I have a paid program called Steady Start. I'll put details in the video description so you can check that out if you think you need it. The main challenge people have in this phase is you've gone through all those things that you've gone through, and often even at this phase, your symptoms may still be quite high. In fact, a lot of people don't start to see changes in their symptoms until phase 4. Some people, and you'll see them in the comment section sometimes, will get a huge dose of what I think of as safety from watching a video, and they'll be like, I've been watching your videos for 2 weeks and my symptoms are down by 70%. And if you're one of those people, thank you. I love seeing comments like that. I just know that that's not the case for everyone. So if your symptoms haven't changed, you've begun implementing, or you're deep into implementing, and now you're like, am I doing it right because my symptoms haven't changed? They're not really supposed to change until phase 4. So you are in the right place now. Phase 4 is where people do start to notice changes in symptoms. And often it will start with the distress, anger, fear, and anxiety around the symptoms. And once you start feeling less of that, the actual symptoms themselves will start to change. And this change follows many different patterns. It's completely individual. For some people, they'll notice just kind of a change in baseline. Maybe one day the baseline will be a little bit lower and then it'll come back up, or it'll stay at that new low level and bounce around a little bit but start trending down. For other people, they'll notice a change in their most intense sensations, or maybe even just 1 or 2 sensations, but their baseline will stay the same. And other people, this is probably people's favorite, will start to experience low symptom or symptom-free times. But if you're deep into phase 4, into implementing, you've been doing a lot of work, and you've already watched the video that I'm going to link to in the video description about why people sometimes have trouble recovering from neural circuit dizziness. That video might tell you what you might not be implementing the way you need to implement. Then fear not, some people do not see a change in symptoms until phase 5. Phase 5 is integration. It's when people's focus starts to shift away from symptoms. And this is a critical point for those of you who have not seen a change in symptoms in phase 4. For some of you, all of the constant focus on trying to make sensations better, which is again very common in phase 4, that's the big thing that's actually keeping symptoms going. All the attention, all the focus, all of the nurturing, even if they're really, really good tools that you're using. Phase 5 is where people just kind of start to let go of that a lot. And they really genuinely are focused on the process, not on the symptoms themselves. So one tip I have for you, if you're still in phase 4 and you're like, I don't know if I'm actually not so focused on the symptoms right now, you can focus on process goals. Process goals are goals that relate to things other than the big goal, which is symptom recovery, obviously, for many of you. You're going to be focusing on things like your reactions, or how you relate to stress, or how you relate to yourself, or how you relate to other people. And I have many videos in which I talk about process goals, so I'll include another video in the description for you to watch on that as well. Back to phase 5. So in phase 5, many of you are coming out of phase 4 with a huge reduction in symptoms, and you're just kind of continuing that process of growing, of caring for yourself, of really getting that this is a nervous system related thing that requires your attention, that it's not really about the symptoms anymore. And some of you are emerging from phase 4 with that new mindset, and this is where the big symptom change starts to happen. One challenge I want to bring your attention to for this phase is that sometimes people feel a lot of grief, and sometimes people will notice an uptick in anxiety at this point as well. The anxiety uptick can happen in phase 4 as well, but in this phase, often what's happening is you have to deal with the aftermath of getting out of a really tough situation that may have been affecting you for a very long period of time. There's fallout from the symptoms themselves and other changes you've had to make as the result of the symptoms. There may be other things that you've uncovered during the recovery process, during that implementation phase. So just be on the lookout for grief and sometimes, again, anxiety, which is often covering up the need to grieve over the lost time or the lost self who disappeared at times throughout this entire process. Now, what many of you will notice is that the success stories often are recorded at the end of phase 4 or in phase 5. So this phase 4 and phase 5 is where people typically get to 70 to 90% recovery. Some people certainly get to 100% in stage 5 and go live their merry lives. But it's actually quite normal while people are still in this period of, I'm focusing on growth, I'm focusing on taking care of my nervous system, the symptoms are no longer an issue, for the symptoms to just take more time to come down. And I've talked about this in previous videos, but what set your nervous system up to be really sensitive and develop chronic symptoms likely took some time. So it's only fair to expect your nervous system to need some time to, again, know that you're safe. So stage 5, usually, even when people still have sensations and say things like, I'm 80% recovered, I'm 90% recovered, they're not really bothered by them. They're still working, they're still doing their daily life activities, they're feeling good, but they may still have sensations that may or may not be out of their norm. Phase 6 is really where people get to 100%. And phase 6 is just thriving and living. This is where you just no longer think of yourself as recovering from anything. This is just the new way that you live your life. You are utterly not focused on symptoms or improvements other than in a normal human desire to grow and change way. And often what will happen here is whatever residual symptoms are around are just going to kind of fade away into the background until one day you're going to say, oh man, it's been a really long time since I've noticed that. Oh, wow, I guess it went away. That's what happens in phase 6. And that's also why, again, many of the success story interviews you're seeing on my channel have people in them who are still dealing with very small amounts of symptoms. It's because they decide to do a success story as they're on the brink of going and living their lives free of this nonsense. They're not going to be visiting my channel and watching interviews and thinking about dizziness or growth and recovery all the time. We do the interview, they go live their lives, and frequently what will happen is they'll write me an email 6 months, a year later, and I'll say, oh, how are you feeling? And they're like, oh, yeah, life's normal, everything's fine. You know, I notice a sensation every now and then, but I don't know if that's actually like a dizziness symptom or if that's just normal dizziness at this point, which we've talked about also in previous videos. One more video to recommend to you who are new here. If you want to know what normal dizziness means, you should check out the video I did on all the symptoms that can occur with neural circuit dizziness. Again, link in the video description. So that's it. Those are the phases of recovery. And I hope that this gives you a little bit of peace of mind, especially again, for those of you who are like, I think I'm doing the stuff, but is it normal for me to still have sensations or to still be thinking this way or dealing with these challenges? The chances are that absolutely you're just in a different phase of recovery than full recovery or living your life. So you will get there. This process takes time. The common thread between 5 and 6 is that you let go of the recovery process a little bit and really just focus on taking care of yourself and living your life. And I know you will get there. So thank you again so much for tuning in. I hope this helped, and please leave questions and comments below. You can also subscribe to my channel. Please do that. Like the video, share it if you found it helpful. My goal is to reach as many people as possible so we get them out of phase 1 of recovery and into the later phases where they can start to feel better. All right, everyone, take care. Bye.